Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, college football fans, college athletic fans across the nation and around the world. This is Tim May with yet another Tim May podcast. Man, the news never quits happening here in the world of college football and the world of college athletics. And a fellow I've had on a few times. He's one of my favorite people on here. Of course, I say that about everybody, Bill Bender. Anybody who agrees to be on my podcast is one of my favorite people. But Bill Bender from the Sporting News, welcome back to the Tim May podcast, my man.
Hey, Tim, how you doing, man? Thanks for having me on.
I'm good, man, especially since it seems like we got a really clear signal all the way to Pickerington as we record this. And I really do appreciate you, man. You keep your ear to the ground, et cetera, your foot on the gas, covering basically college football, but other sports for the Sporting News. But, as we get into this, we're just now learning this week that all of a sudden Nick Saban has inked a deal that keeps him at Alabama through what? He'll be 77 years old, 28-29 football season. What do you think about that, Bill? What's the message Alabama's sending to the rest of the world, including Ohio State?
Well, it's just bad news for the rest of the FBS because we've all kind of tried to put a expiration date on what's probably been the most prolonged dynasty in the history of college football. So I think 8 years, we talked about it before I came on, it settles debates with recruiting, with all of the uncertainty with national name, image, and likeness. And it sends a message, like I said, to the rest of the college football world. I mean, since 2007, when he took over, the two schools with the best records are Alabama and Ohio State. The only other two schools with a winning percentage over 80% are Boise State and Oklahoma.
Yeah,
but those two schools aren't the national brands. And maybe I'm disrespecting Oklahoma a little bit, but they haven't won a national championship since 2000. Ohio State, Alabama, multiple national titles since then. And it's always an arms race between those two and Clemson and everybody else.
Yeah, it is amazing. And, I wanted to get into this with you. Ohio State just completed its first massive official visits a weekend, if that's what you want to call it, this past weekend and stuff, because recruiting, it seems, is back into full swing. I mean, you've noticed that around the country, right? I mean, the big time programs are wasting no time getting back on the beaten path.
Well, they got your guy Berm over there busy, I'm sure, as we get into camp season, which is nice because last year during COVID, we didn't have camp season. It made it more difficult. I'm seeing a lot of videos pop up on my timeline, whether it's an Arch Manning throw or a Quinn Ewers throw and those kind of things. I mean, both of those guys, obviously mega recruits that are being courted over the next couple seasons here. But it's good to see. And I think one of the big things to watch, and Berm could probably offer more insight on that than me, is just the roster management factor with the super seniors and the scholarship limits. And will these classes not, Ohio State, what do they, Tim, they bring in what? 20 to 25 to sometimes 30 in a class. I don't think that number is going to be very high in 2021 because of some of those things that happened because of COVID.
Yeah, the 30, I think you're thinking about Alabama, the oversigned capital of the world. 20 to 25 is about where Ohio State usually fits. And it is interesting, man. I mean, you got classes coming, going sideways. I mean, Ohio State and Alabama are among the few schools that are still recruiting one of the plums out there, JT Tuimoloau, the defensive end from Washington State. I mean, there's a guy that could change a roster just by signing with whomever he signs, and it'll be immediate. I mean, he'll be eligible this fall, and he's taking his official visits later this month everywhere, and it's really going to be interesting to see where he lands. I think Ohio State, talking with Berm, as you said, Jeremy Birmingham, our resident expert, along with Spencer Holbrook, there was a feeling that he was Ohio State bound several months ago, but that feeling's kind of gone to the wayside now a little bit. It seems like a wide open affair, perhaps between Ohio State and Alabama. But it is interesting. It's Ohio State or Alabama for a kid from the state of Washington, right?
well, I mean, in those two, obviously, you want to get those defensive lineman centerpieces because it really sets the tone for everything else. I mean, I look at Clemson. One of the things that I think they're going to bounce back defensively this year is they played some freshman 5-star defensive linemen last year. And another guy that we both know, Marcus Hartman, and I always talk about that, where that freshman year, you get beat up a little bit. Even a guy like Jack Sawyer, which made his spring game performance so amazing, was you expect freshman defensive linemen to go through that until they're ready. And, you probably won't see as good as Jack's going to be. You'll probably see the best of him by the time he's a junior with Larry Johnson after 2 cycles. I mean, the same thing happened with Chase Young and both Boza brothers. They're great when they come in, and I'm not saying they're not going to make an impact right away, but it takes a couple years.
Yeah, I was going to say, though, man, if they end up with Jack Sawyer and Tui Molowau on the same freshman relief squad, going in for Harrison or Tariq Smith and those guys, I mean, wow, that will be the rich getting richer, right? I mean, I would love to see that, to be honest with you, because Jack Sawyer was almost unblockable in the spring game. You saw it, and it was a tag sack kind of thing as far as getting sacks in that game. Well, no matter how you say tag sack or tap sack, it still sounds a little
right.
Iffy, right?
Well, Jerry hasn't come up with a stat for that over at OSU on the press box yet. You'll have to get on Jerry Emick about that.
Let's make it tap tackle. There we go, of the quarterback. That sounds right. A lot better. But, both of these guys are in that ilk. I mean, like I said, the rich getting richer. But, boy, if you're Larry Johnson, you're champing at the bit to get that on campus, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, I mean, that'll be one of the big battles worth watching. And maybe I'm not saying one recruit is the reason why, but certainly why the news of the Nick Saban extension is out now is it does stabilize recruiting. I mean, obviously he's competing with younger guys like Ryan Day, who, to our knowledge, won't leave Ohio State anytime soon, doesn't have any reason to. Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma, who he'd be a better bet to go to the NFL to me than Day, just because of where he's located. And then Dabo and those guys, obviously it is what it is. And then he's competing with the rest of the SEC and all the dirty backhanded things that go on down there. So I think that's why. So that'll be one recruit worth watching. But again, I think it's all barreling toward the season. We're all kind of watching July 1st to see how name, image, and likeness not being across all 50 states. That's been a big talking point in the last month. And of course, everything else. I mean, we're in that part of the season now, Tim, where from now until July 4th, Sporting News will be putting out a bunch of those listy type things that we like to argue about. And, that's part of the game. We enjoy doing it.
Give me a preview of one listy thing you're looking forward to as far as you think could really stir the pot this during, I guess you'd call it the off season. For guys like me and you, there's never an off season, but give me something you think's going to stir the pot a little bit.
Well, the Big Ten, I started the coach rankings today, and I have this big, long spreadsheet. And anybody that really knows me knows I'm a spreadsheet nerd. I will spreadsheet anything from my weekly schedule to, with the youth sports that my kids do. I'm doing Pickerington Lax Cat stats and Midwest Marlin stats and pink tie-dye softball stats. So my point is, as I started to do the coach list today, and I started getting into the meat of the Big Ten guys. So I'll cheat with you. I mean, obviously Ryan Day will be one. I mean, that's not a big spoiler alert. He's only lost a couple games there. And who do you do two though? Who is it? James Franklin? Is it Christ? Is it Harbaugh? Is it Kirk Ferentz is having a quiet, good 3-year stretch that's a little bit better than those three.
Yeah, he's kind of like, instead of just going like Kirk Ferentz usually goes like this, it's like a cosine, or is that sine or cosine? I can't remember. It's been a little bit more of a up here, but I'll tell you the guy that's done the most with the least, at least up to this moment, and I know it's a knee-jerk reaction based on last year. Tom Allen is doing a hell of a job, and from everybody you talk to over there, they're doing a hell of a job in recruiting too. I mean, do not equate it at the level of Ohio State, but if you get the players you really want that fit your style and you coach them up, so to speak, you can have a really good football team. And we saw that last year with Indiana. Indiana was no joke last year. It'll be interesting to see if they can bounce back from a quarterback standpoint and everything else this year, because they made some plays when it really mattered last year, which really helped that streak along. And even when they lost to Ohio State, that second half was one for the ages for Indiana. But I think Tom Allen, if I had to pick a second guy that's doing a hell of a job in the Big Ten, it would probably be him. And I'm really interested to see what happens with Minnesota this year with PJ Fleck, because I I didn't see last year as a referendum on anything except one thing, was that the elite stayed elite last year. I'm talking about nationally. I'm talking about Ohio State, Clemson, and Alabama, and even Oklahoma. The elite stayed elite and during a tough situation. But everybody else, man, paid the price one way or the other. You agree with that, right?
Oh, for sure. And I think Minnesota, Penn State, Michigan, Wisconsin, even Iowa, they didn't play enough games. I mean, yeah, we know the bottom dropped out at Michigan a little bit, and Penn State had a terrible season, but it's almost like I think Penn State will get more of a pardon for that than Michigan because there's so much pressure on Jim Harbaugh this year. So again, it's tough to separate all those guys. That once you get 2 to 7, I mean, we didn't even talk about Pat Fitzgerald and another guy. When you said a guy that does more with less, I thought that's where you were going. But I mean, Tom Allen obviously had a big year. Indiana, to me, and I always look, maybe it's just following the Big Ten as long as I have. If they don't have an encore, it will go unnoticed, is what I'm saying. There's less pressure there than there is at places like Michigan, where it's an all or nothing year. Or Penn State, I mean, they wanted to fire Franklin last year. If Penn State comes out and has a rough year, I mean, I think the expectations of those programs, obviously, they're expected to do what Indiana and Northwestern have been doing. Minnesota, you brought them up. They're a very interesting team this year because they got their quarterback back.
Yeah.
And that would be the other list we're doing is, our top 25 quarterbacks will be out later this week. I'm not going to spoil where I have Stroud and Penix and Tanner Morgan. They're the 3 Big Ten quarterbacks on that list.
Yeah. Oh, so you've already got Stroud being the starter at the Ohio State University. I got you. I was going to get to that with you in a minute. I'll get to that in a minute. One guy we left off, maybe you said him and I didn't, kind of went by me because a lot of times this guy is totally forgotten, is Paul Chryst at Wisconsin. I mean, there's no doubt, they've carried on. It's going to be interesting to see without Barry Alvarez there as their interim coach when they need him, how that program's going to go. I'm sure it's going to go fine. I mean, he's been, out of the loop in terms of recruiting for a while now, but Paul Chryst, there's definitely a name that deserves even sort of national recognition, right?
Oh, for sure. And again, their season was so ripped apart by COVID last year. I remember the opener against Illinois, you're thinking, okay, these guys are going to challenge the Buckeyes again, at least make it interesting in Indianapolis. And then it just got all taken away. So, and then at the end of the year, they had trouble scoring. They really did. So, but they're a team to keep an eye on in the Big Ten as well. But and you and I have had this conversation a couple times where there's a big mountain to climb to catch up to Ohio State. I mean, this isn't the mid to late 90s when on any given year, Penn State and Ohio State were playing in a top 5 game, or Michigan or Wisconsin, and it was a true toss-up. It's kind of where I'm at now is wake me up when Ohio State loses one of these games. And you don't, and I know that's something that Ryan Day probably has to guard against because we all kind of assume, okay, it's going to be Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma. But I think they've done a good job of managing that and finding ways to stay motivated. Last year, using Clemson, obviously, and it'll be this year, what will he use? Because on the flip side of it, Tim, I think Jim Harbaugh's tried every coaching ploy possible to try to beat Ohio State, and none of them have worked. And that's what makes this year so interesting is Michigan could go 7-4, 8-3, 9-2, doesn't matter. It's all going to come down. The national referendum on that program comes down to what they do against the Buckeyes.
Yeah, and that will be at Michigan. The asterisk is last year when they didn't get to play, and I had Master Teague III's dad on last week on this podcast. He's talking about a lot of things because he was one of the movers and shakers that helped there be a Big Ten season last fall, along with a bunch of other parents from Ohio State and elsewhere. But he was talking about how one of the reasons Master, his son wanted to come back at running back was, obviously he didn't have the year he wanted last year. He's coming off an Achilles injury in the spring of that year. And number two, one of the other reasons is he wants another shot at Michigan before he leaves. I mean, these guys can't get enough, of playing Michigan and knowing that basically right now they have the superior program. And it is interesting whether this new, the coaching staff, once again, a little bit revamped at Michigan, how it's going to play out. But you've got to be stunned by number of players who entered the transfer portal this year, Bill, from Michigan. It's in the teens, and it's like, are you kidding me? I mean, what do you think is really, from your observing from afar, what's just your feel on that?
Well, I mean, guys come and go, and some of these, I think the coaching changes were good for their staff, for what they're trying to do. I think bringing in a new defense was needed. Don Brown's defense, which you could honestly blame Ryan Day for that, because and we were both at that game, the Dwayne Haskins, I don't even remember, was it 68? The 68 points they put on him. I think that was the end of Don Brown.
Yeah.
And then everybody else started using crossing routes, and they've been doing that for a couple years. So bringing in Mike McDonald should help. Bringing in Mike Hart, I know that's a guy that Ohio State fans absolutely loathe, but he's probably the last legitimate running back Michigan had. I mean, 3 1,000-yard seasons. I think he's young. He understands what that program needs, and he'll do a good job. He did a good job at Indiana. He was a big reason why Indiana had success on offense. So, but the question is, they gave all those assistants 3-year contracts. So what do you do with Harbaugh if they go 7-5? Are they going to ride this out for 3 years with him, or are they going to go chase Matt Campbell if Iowa State has a big year? Because I still think he's the most logical replacement whenever they move from Harbaugh. But it's funny with that, because if Iowa State's 7-5 too, then what do you do? Yeah. So I think they're in a tough spot as a program. I've always said, at least since Harbaugh got there, the biggest difference isn't necessarily developing NFL players. Michigan's put a lot of guys in the NFL, Tim.
Yes.
Difference to me is they don't put the top 10 pick guys in the NFL. The Okuda, the Chase Young, the Bozas. Ohio State's had back-to-back first-round quarterbacks. I think Michigan's last first-round quarterback is...
I don't remember. Chad Henne, maybe? I don't know.
Oh, he wasn't a first. I think you'd have to go back, maybe Gerbach, but I don't even think he was. So it's been a while since Michigan's had a legitimate first-round quarterback. And
but let me interrupt you. It's been a while since Michigan. I mean, you can be a really good college quarterback and not be a first-round draft pick, as you well know. I mean, Tom Brady,
right.
Great example. Joe Montana, but the point is, it's been a while since Michigan had a quarterback that you thought it could really lean on. You know what I mean? I mean, like JT Barrett. I mean, JT Barrett, whether he ever plays much pro football, was a hell of a college quarterback. He fit the system. He ran the system. And, that's what you don't even, it's kind of hard to feel what even Michigan's all about on offense, these days. And whether Mike Hart helps kind of like redefine that, I think is going to be a thing to watch. I mean, clearly you got to be able to run the ball at some point, in the Big Ten, but you've definitely got to be able to throw the ball with consistency in the Big Ten now. I think they have a shot.
Well, let's run down the difference between the quarterback competitions then. So at Michigan, you've got Cade McNamara, and he played okay in place of Milton last year. I mean, if you want to put beating Rutgers as a positive, I suppose you could do that. I mean, he played well in that game, and then he got hurt. And then you have a 5-star freshman, JJ McCarthy, and a transfer in Alan Bowman from Texas Tech. Well, if McNamara starts and struggles early, how early do they push up the timetable on McCarthy? And I think on a grander scale, Ohio State might be dealing with that, because Stroud, from my vantage point, I mean, when you make that quarterback list, and I put it in the blurb, I can spoil that too, is this is under the assumption he wins the starting job, because whoever starts at Ohio State's going to be productive. Now it's just a question of who. Does he hold off? Do they bring up Mccord, or is it Miller? I mean, that's why fall camp, this is much less, and you and I have been through a couple of these. This isn't the Barrett, Cardale, and Braxton's playing receiver battle, and it's not Tate and Dwayne and Joe Burrow in the spring. And that's kind of surprising to me that this quarterback battle isn't getting more maybe national run, and you maybe can tell me why.
Well, I think one of the reasons is I think there's enough faith in Ryan Day right now, and the fact when you check the pedigree of all three of these quarterbacks, one of these guys is probably going to be damn good, because, it's like I always equate things to auto racing or boxing, but auto racing, you can be the world's most talented race car driver, but if you're in the wrong car, if you're in the team that doesn't have a clue about what it's doing with its race car, you're in deep, deep trouble. You're not going to be top of the grid. But Ohio State has put together a ridiculous race car for somebody to drive. I mean, when you look at, this is as talented. I said this last year, and I'm going to reiterate it. I'm going to add to that. I'm going to add a trump card to that. This is the most talented offensive roster I've ever seen at Ohio State. I'm talking about not necessarily the greatest players at individual positions, but the deepest at wide receiver, at possibly at tight end, for sure. On the offensive line, they've got about 8 or 9 guys that can play. Running back, they've got to figure out between 5 or 6 guys who's going to be their running back. Travion Henderson is the real deal. Master Teague III wants to prove some things. And then, and then at quarterback, you're sitting there with 3 thoroughbreds of different ilks, but Kyle Mccord, man, you watch him in the spring. Oh my goodness. You can see why everybody had him as a 5-star and big time player. So that's why I think it hadn't gotten the competition hadn't gotten as much run, because I think the idea there is the confidence is that they're going to find somebody for sure.
No, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something to keep in mind with Ohio State. I just think whoever the quarterback there is, whoever the quarterback at Alabama is going to be Bryce Young, and Clemson, of course, with DJ Uiagalelei. I think that's one of the big themes of the season, is that the 3 superpowers in the sport are all breaking in new quarterbacks, and they just produce first-round quarterbacks. And Tim, I think it kind of circles back to what we were talking about recruiting. That's the new game within the game is, and I'll rope Oklahoma in there because they have Spencer Rattler, the Heisman front runner. And when you see some of these lists, he'll probably be ranked number 1 across most of them. So the 4 programs that we're talking about there, all of their coaches have kind of resigned. Even Saban, it's an offensive game now. We've got to score 40 to 45 points. We've got to have elite quarterback play. And they're stockpiling quarterbacks all the way down into their junior year in high school that are 5-star guys. That's why Ewers, who I saw him on my timeline and his haircut on my timeline more than anything else last week, and him throwing it around. And then this weekend it was Arch Manning who visited Clemson. So, and we all know the bloodline there. So I think that's this contest of who can produce the best first-round quarterback has become an interesting development in the last couple of years.
Well, here's the thing. 707 and everything else is going on. You've got to take advantage of what the system is spewing. The system is spewing big, wide open offenses. I'm talking about from the high school, junior high, middle school on up, shooting big time wide open offenses with wide receivers who are more than competent when they show up in college. Marvin Harrison Jr. is ridiculous. He's going to be a freshman. He's so much bigger, and maybe, and as good a pass catcher maybe as his dad. That's crazy. But where his bloodlines, and he's a bigger version of his dad, maybe even faster, who knows. But and the rules all favor throwing the hell out of the ball, and plus, as and I know, and we've talked about this before, you and I have, it is rare on a college defense for you to have 5 great defensive backs. You may have some tags coming in along the way that say that this guy was a 4-star or 5-star, but there's a weakness in every secondary in college football, including Alabama, including Ohio State, including Clemson, as you saw in that semifinal game last year, including for sure Oklahoma, Texas, right on down the line. And you're an idiot if you don't exploit that. And I think coaches, even like you said, Nick Saban has come around to that point.
Well, yeah, and a receiver, and that's what makes Ohio State, to me, right there. As in terms of if we're talking about national championship favorite, the last 2 years it has been receivers become the most important position. Now, maybe not the most important, but very important when you look at, I think the stat was out there that every guy in that LSU Alabama game 2 years ago, pretty much every skill position guy has been drafted since. Which is crazy. Alabama with their receiver room last year, they had the best receiver room. And the year before LSU did, when you have Terrace Marshall and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and Thaddeus Moss. And that's what Ohio State has now. And even though Jamison Williams transferred, it's very rare. And when you have 2 guys right out the chute in Olavey and Garrett Wilson, to me, they're both first rounders. You talked about Marvin Harrison Jr., the sophomores that got experience last year. I was always having trouble picking who I thought the best one was. But they would all make a flash play here and there. And
Jackson Smith and Jigba, there's a guy to keep your eye on, without a doubt. And then Emeka Egbuka, another one of those freshmen, along with Marvin Harrison Jr. It's a loaded room, man. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? A little bit. You've been around this area for a long time. You don't remember a room that deep at Ohio State, do you?
Well, I remember tandems though.
You remember tandems. I'm talking about 4 and 5 and 6 deep, but go ahead though. Yeah, you're right.
Like the one that, like, whenever I think about Ohio State for receivers, like the first one that always pops in my head is David Boston, D. Miller.
Yeah.
And then they had, they had Ricky Dudley in there before that with Terry Glenn, because they had that big presence in the middle. And I think who was opposite Terry Glenn? Was it?
I don't even remember now. And you were going to ask me that.
I think Stanley, maybe like a Demetrius Stanley or
as a matter of fact, definitely in 96. He ended up being one of the key guys in that on that team. And but with Terry Glenn, there's a great example, but they've never had this depth, in my opinion. It was Demetrius Stanley and David Boston on that 96 team, because you remember, and then D. Miller, but David Boston catches the winning touchdown pass. But, Demetrius Stanley was wide open on the two plays before that. It was just a matter who Joe Germain wanted to throw to. But you're right. I'm just talking about just a depth standpoint, which, look at Alabama last year. Jalen Waddle was probably going to win the Heisman last year, right?
Right.
And he gets hurt.
And then the other guy does. Yeah.
And then the other guy does. The other guy, Devontae Smith, was going to be that second guy who was going to, really be wide open when Jalen Waddle was double teamed or something. Instead, he steps up and emerges as that guy. But you look at Chris Olavey, how much they missed him in that Northwestern game Ohio State did, and what a difference he made, even against Alabama. He had some really good catches against Alabama. You're right. The fact that he decided to return for his senior year, I think really just exacerbates the point I'm making of the depth there at that position. Let me ask you one other thing. I know you've got to get going here, and but what is the storyline out there nationally that you've got your eye on through these summer months that you think could make, and you can ponder this for a minute, that you think could make a difference once this season gets upon us?
Well, I think that the expansion talk has been out there, and it's a tired topic. But if we do get the same four, if we get Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Ohio State in the playoff, will that speed up the expansion talk? And I say that because a couple of weeks ago we ran here are the 5 teams that could make the playoff for the first time in 2021. And whenever I write something like that, I write it kind of thinking from a cynical nature, none of these teams are going to the playoff. I can give you a case for Texas A&M, and I can give you the case for Iowa State, North Carolina, and USC. And Cincinnati's interesting to me because they maybe could force that a little bit if they go 12-0, beat Notre Dame, beat Indiana, and continue what Luke's been able to do down there. But yeah, if we get all 4 of those teams again, how loud is that 18 playoff talk going to deafen college football? And I say that because I look at this sport right now, and it's nobody's problem in Columbus or Tuscaloosa or Norman or Clemson right now. But I think if you're not a fan of one of those 4 schools, you're feeling, they're starting to feel that. And I think there's some resignation in some spots where there isn't. The apathy levels at places like Michigan and Auburn, who just hired Brian Harsin, and the apathy level around that hire. The Pac-12 as a whole conference. So what school can really pop up? And it took a record-setting season from LSU and Joe Burrow to break up the establishment a little bit. But that's what I'm watching to see if this 4-team monopoly on the sport, and I would rope Notre Dame and Georgia into there too, because those 6 schools have had 23 of the 28 playoff appearances. Yeah. If the NCAA tournament was like that in basketball, combined with those guys only stay 1 year anyway, the ratings on that would drop. Yeah.
I'm looking up as you're speaking now. I'm looking up the ratings for the national championship game, and it averaged 18.65 million viewers across the 3 or 4 networks. It was on a drop of 27%,
which is stunning because of the brand.
This was Alabama versus Ohio State. Right. the two of the premier legacy programs in the country, and people were at home because of COVID-19, et cetera. And the rating dropped 27%. So clearly something needs to be done to shake it up. But hey, you look at Alabama and Ohio State, dude. I grew up an Alabama fan. I always have to say that to clear the air. Football's never been it was never close to this in the Bear Bryant era. There were some really good runs like in the 70s for Bear Bryant, but not like this. Nick Saban, 6 national championships in 14 seasons. Are you kidding me? And those are ones you had to win on the field. He's had 7 national championships total as a head coach. Bear had 6 national championships, wire service national championships, over his 25 seasons. But that should have been, this is a collision of the giants, and the ratings dropped 27% when people were at home. So what does that tell you? I mean, I'm not sure you can fix that,
Right. And expansion may not fix that right away, but at least you give other teams more shots. And again, it's kind of like,
my point is if you go to 8 games, 8 teams, but then you still have those 2 teams playing for the national championship, right, is that going to pique people's interest more? I mean, I'm not sure I agree with that.
It goes both ways. I mean, like some pro sports thrive on that. Like we still talk about the Lakers and Celtics rivalry from the 80s. We still, I mean, there was a period in baseball where it was like Braves Yankees, and you kind of assume that was going to happen. And I guess back in the 60s, it would have been Braves in Brooklyn, or not Braves in Brooklyn, Yankees in Brooklyn. Let me get that right.
Well, early 60s. Yeah.
It was the late Yankees 60s, every year.
Yeah. Late 60s came along Baltimore, New York Mets, and all these kind of guys. But you're right. I mean, go ahead now.
But I think the drain is just seeing those same teams over and over again, and not, but I think those rivalries are kind of cool within, because I mean, we've seen in the last 2 years, Ohio State and Clemson kind of trade. Clemson's beat Ohio State, maybe it wasn't 2 years ago, but before that, the beat down, the rivalry that's kind of emerged between those two.
Yeah.
Alabama and Ohio State have traded a couple. Clemson and Alabama have played 4 times. And, it doesn't hurt to have a Notre Dame in there, because I think Notre Dame being good helps no matter what anybody says. And maybe that's the Catholic school background talking, but Notre Dame being good is good for college football. Don't care what anybody says.
Yeah. Well, last thing, really, it kind of flies in the face of this idea, though, that offense, sells tickets and puts fannies in seats. I mean, like I said, 27% drop of just your TV audience. Again, these 2 teams, these two legacies, these 2 blue bloods, I'm talking about Alabama and Ohio State, have never played offense like they did last year. I mean, you know what I mean? It's never been that prolific. And if anything, fewer people wanted to watch it. So, hey, last thing before you go, Jack Sawyer, as we know, he's from Pickerington. I remember you telling the anecdote about him meeting your son long ago in a Sizzler or something like that. No, I'm just joking about the Sizzler. But it is pretty exciting. Even your son has gotten to meet a guy that could be emerge as a big time star for Ohio State, didn't it? It kind of piques people's interest, doesn't it?
Well, I'm plugging everything in Pickerington, that was at Combustion, the local brewery here. And Jack obviously was with his parents eating. There was nothing bad going on there.
But and your son obviously with his parents, since you were at a brewery. Now go ahead.
I was definitely drinking, so no, but that was one of those things, and definitely got to see Jack, and I think that's something that they've done here in Pickerington. And you've seen guys roll through the Ohio State program, the Michigan program, the Michigan State program, and that's what it's become here. And, Coach Hillerich at Pickerington North and Coach Sherrod at Pickerington Central have just done a fantastic job of building. I was over at my daughter was doing a volleyball camp today, actually, walking it through, and you see kids conditioning and you see how big they are. And I'm like, man, did I just walk in a college locker room or what? But they've done a good job of doing it with the competitive mindset. It starts with the youth football programs here. But to see Jack have the success that he has, that's one, I can say that safely. That's one Buckeye I'm definitely hoping goes on to a really successful NFL career, because you've seen him do it the right way here all the way through. And tell you what, Tim, if he didn't play football, I'm pretty sure he could play for the basketball team too.
Yeah. I had him on my podcast, remember, last year.
Yeah.
But he was one of those guys who's also poised to take advantage of the name, image, and likeness thing to build his brand. He talked about that then, what was coming and stuff. And he definitely is one of those guys that could really exploit that, isn't he?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's what that's built for. And, with Ohio State athletes, there are so many that you and I have talked about that I think what name, image, and likeness will help. And is those guys that maybe don't, and that Jack doesn't qualify here, but the guys that maybe don't go to the NFL career, the long tenured career. We just dropped a D Miller reference a couple of weeks ago. I remember D Miller, and a lot of Buckeye fans probably do too, because he was a heck of a wide receiver. Maybe didn't have the NFL career that some others did, but they're those guys, the guys that maybe you see on the TV a little bit, but they go on and be around Columbus. And there are so many of them. That's one thing I have learned through the youth sports scene is you see a Craig Krenzel baseball team now, and his kids are playing. I've talked to my buddies in UA, and there's a lot of former Buckeyes up in the UA area. And it's cool because my kid, maybe not that big as some of their kids, but it's cool to have them compete. And you figure that with that, those are the guys that could have more success and get more out of the college experience to make what they're worth then, because they deserve that.
Yeah, it is interesting how many former Buckeye football players. Some people call them former Buckeyes. They're always Buckeyes, but former players at Ohio State opt to move back into the Central Ohio area because there are all kinds of things that you can take advantage of, and including the fact it's over 2 million population area. Whereas Tuscaloosa, I'm not sure offers that many. Post graduation, post moving on opportunities for the players and stuff. That's what makes this Ohio State program, I think, very, very unique as opposed to just unique. I like to be redundant if I can. But Bill Bender, speaking of being redundant, man, thanks for being on the Tim May podcast again.
Yeah, you can check out all our stuff at sportingnews.com. I always enjoy coming on to talking to you, about Berm and the work that you guys do over there. I know you got 2 OU grads over there doing a hell of a job, and Spencer Holbrook and Pete Nakos. They're the best. And I'm glad that you got some green over there, even though you guys are all about scarlet and gray.
Well, like I said, I paid tuition for my son to go to Ohio University way back when, Kyle May, and I always tell that story. The time that when Ohio U was beating Ohio State at halftime or whatever, and they're all in a bar up on Court Street. Is it Court Street? Do I have that right? They're all rooting.
What do you mean? Is that what it is? Of course it's Court Street.
I know. They're all rooting and ranting and all this kind of stuff. And all of a sudden they said they all figured out, oh my goodness, wait a minute. What if Ohio State gets beat? Right. In other words, they wanted Ohio U to be competitive, but Ohio State still runs the state, in terms of who you're rooting for on the big stage. But that's pretty funny. That's a good anecdote. But hey, Bill Bitter, thanks for joining me again, man, on the Tim May podcast. I finally got that out after 3 tries. But, ladies and gentlemen, until next week, this is Tim May. We'll see you then.